The glass was thick, layered against the heat of the Istanbul night, but not thick enough to obscure the reflection. It showed a man, weary and slightly overweight, staring intently at a spreadsheet of chemical equations. On the lens of the high-powered camera, the man's breath created faint halos of moisture. This man was Dr. Farzan Zahiri, and the equations on his screen were blueprints for devastation. For 3 years, he had been a ghost of brilliant physicists specializing in neutron initiation, effectively the quiet engine that drives a nuclear warhead. Zahiri hadn't merely advanced the program, he had miniaturized it. At 3:17 a.m., through the narrow scope, the analyst in the bunker thousands of miles away watched Zahiri stand, stretch, and then insert a flash drive into the laptop. The red light on the drive blinked twice. Data transfer complete. This was the moment. The culmination of 17 months of brutal, grinding reconnaissance. If they failed now, if that data left the apartment, the geopolitical landscape of the entire decade would be rewritten in fire. But the flash drive wasn't the target. It was the bait. And everyone in the operation knew it. To understand this cold, calculated chaos, and the almost impossible set of skills required to navigate it. We must rewind the clock back to the moment the profile of Dr. Zahiri landed on the desk of Director Yi. It was not a traditional assassination or snitch and grab target. Zahiri was too cautious, too well protected, and frankly, too valuable a live knot for extraction. But for understanding the depth of the rabbit hole Israel was facing, the objective was intelligence, pure and surgical. The initial attempts were disastrous. Conventional methods, the street teams. The satellite sweeps all hit brick walls. Zahiri operated on a schedule that was simultaneously rigid and fluid, a contradiction born from paranoia. He used 5 different vehicles in rotation, changed safe houses weekly, and maintained a minimum of 4 secure communication loops, each encrypted with evolving keys. The standard Mossad playbook was useless against this level of operational security. It was clear they needed to adopt a new doctrine. A kind of depotion stealth the agency hadn't previously mastered. They needed patience, not speed, invisibility, not force. They needed to learn how to track a phantom using the patience and precision of a predator waiting for a ripple in the water. They chose Amos. Amos wasn't a stereotypical field agent. He was a linguist, a master of disguise, and most importantly, a student of the silent arts. His specialty was long duration, high-fidelity reconnaissance, skill set often seen in the most disciplined Western Special Operations unit, where failure means the mission never even begins. Amos accepted the assignment with a single condition: absolute autonomy and a budget dedicated entirely to blending, to creating an environment where surveillance was impossible to distinguish from daily life. He was going to turn Istanbul into his own silent theater. The file on Zahiri detailed his deep attachment to a small, specific coffee shop in the Beyoklu district. This was the first contradiction. A man obsessed with operational security should never frequent the same establishment. This was the first thread Amos pulled. It took Amos and his 2-person sub-team, known simply as the Weavers, 6 weeks just to establish a presence in Istanbul that wasn't flagged by local intelligence. They set up 3 businesses: a failing textile importer, a high-end photography repair shop, and, most crucially, a legitimate street vendor stand selling roasted chestnuts near Zahiri's favorite coffee spot. Amos, posing as a retired German industrialist named Klaus, spent weeks merely observing the flow of the city, the taxi shifts, the patterns of the municipal cleaning trucks, the placement of every public camera. This was the foundation, understanding the environment so intimately that they became part of its acoustic signature. When they finally tracked Zahiri to the coffee shop, the physicist spent precisely 17 minutes there, always at 10 a.m. on Tuesdays and Fridays. He ordered the same Turkish coffee, read a local paper, and departed. The first breakthrough came when Amos noticed the waiter. Every time Zahiri left, the waiter cleared his table and, instead of washing the cup immediately, he tapped the bottom twice with his spoon before taking it back to the counter. Amos didn't need a high-tech listening device. He needed to understand the signaling chain. They substituted the original ceramic cup with an identical one fitted with a mic. The results were deafeningly silent. No conversation, no data transfer, just the sound of sipping coffee. This confirmed Amos's suspicion. Zahiri was deliberately burning a location. He was using the coffee shop as a falsa bandiera, a false flag. He wanted asterisks to be seen there. The real surveillance, the true meeting, had to be somewhere impossibly better. The realization shifted the focus from tracking Zahiri's actions to tracking Zahiri's asterisks. Where did he go that required no security, no change of car, and no unusual timing. The answer was the city's infrastructure. Every Sunday, Zahiri spent an hour walking through a massive, sprawling municipal park bordering the old city. He carried nothing but a bottle of water and wore a worn denim jacket. He walked the same precise 2.5-kilometer path. The difficulty was that the park was swarming with people, couples, children, and vendors. It was the worst possible place for covert observation. But Zahiri chose it for that exact reason. In a sea of targets, the hunter disappears. Amos deployed a revolutionary method. Instead of tailing the target, they focused on environmental displacement. They planted 3 agents disguised as landscape workers, slowly moving a thicket of rose bushes and installing new sprinkler heads along the path. These sprinklers were high-resolution thermal imaging cameras, disguised in industrial housings. It took another month of patient recording. 99% of the footage was grass, joggers, and dogs. But on the 5th Sunday, the cameras caught something else. Zahiri stopped briefly by an ancient stone fountain. He didn't drink, he didn't rest. He adjusted the cuff of his denim jacket, and that was it. Amos ran the footage frame by frame. When Zahiri adjusted his cuff, a microscopic reflection, a split-second flash bounced off the stone. It wasn't a watch, it was a transmitter signal. Zahiri wasn't meeting anyone. He was uploading compressed data packets to a short-range, heavily protected receiver hidden somewhere nearby. This receiver was the true nexus of his operation. They had been tracking the ghost. Now, they finally had a bead on the actual location of the data hub. It was inside the park, in a century-old abandoned water pumping station used now only by maintenance workers. Zahiri's True Asterix headquarters, was a block away, inside a high-rise residential building, disguised as the apartment of a widowed, elderly woman. The mission changed from tracking to zero-tolerance infiltration. The team prepared for the infiltration phase, a textbook example of what they internally called deep-sea diving. Slow, meticulous movement under massive pressure, where the slightest deviation means the bends or death. Their preparation was less about gear and more about simulating the acoustics of the target building. For 2 weeks, they lived in a mirrored apartment in Tel Aviv, listening to synthesized audio loops of the Istanbul building. The specific hum of the elevator shaft, the squeak of the floorboards in the hall, the sound of the neighbor's television late at night. They had to know the building better than the people who lived there. The entry was scheduled for 2 a.m. on a Friday. The night before, Zahiri traditionally traveled out of the city for his bi-weekly security meeting. Amos and his second, a young specialist named Tamar, approached the target high-rise, disguised as municipal power utility repairman, carrying bouquet, legitimate-looking tool cases. The security guard was easily neutralized, not by force, but by a bureaucratic boredom, a 20-minute argument over the building's compliance status, distracting him long enough for the third member, Ben, to disable the main CCTV feed. They reached the 14th floor. Zahiri's apartment, widow's apartment, was silent. Amos removed a piece of equipment from his case that looked like a common, slightly battered door wedge. It was a sophisticated acoustic resonance detector. He pressed it gently against the heavy wooden door. Inside, the sound was barely audible, the distant, steady pulse of a ventilation unit. Tamar went to work on the lock. She didn't use tension wrenches. She used fiber optics and precision machining tools, bypassing the physical tumbler entirely. The sound was a whisper, the equivalent of a breath catching in the throat. The air pressure inside the apartment shifted the moment the door's seal broke. Amos tasted the metallic temps of adrenaline, the physical rush that signaled the end of preparation and the beginning of irreversible action. They slipped inside. The apartment was a maze of contradictions. The living room smelled of dried flowers, and old laissez-perfect, fragile facade. But the hallway led to a reinforced steel door, disguised as a linen closet. They were now in Zahiri's active workspace. The silence inside was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic, low asterisk through asterisk of server fans. Amos paused by the window. He looked out over the glittering, chaotic sprawl of Istanbul. He could see the minarets of a distant mosque. Below, a man was carefully folding up his market stall, whistling a quiet, mournful tune. It was a perfect, stolen moment of absolute peace. The world outside continued its rotation, oblivious to the fact that 2 people were currently risking global equilibrium in a small, stuffy room 14 stories up. This wasn't about the bomb. It was about the silent, unending cost of preventing it. He breathed out, the calm reset complete. Amos pointed to the main server rack. Tamar nodded and moved towards the target computer. They had 15 minutes. Their objective was not retrieval, but duplication of the hard drive containing the full, high-level simulation models. Tamar attached a small solid-state duplicator to the server's back panel. The transfer began. Silent, agonizingly slow. Amos monitored the entry points. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. The progress bar on the duplicator reached 87%. Then, a faint click resonated from the corner of the room, near an antique grandfather clock. It wasn't the sound of the clock mechanism. It was the sound of a silent pressure plate resetting. Zahiri had a secondary, delayed alarm, completely independent of the main security system. Amos froze. The clock was ticking, but the real ticking was happening in his ears. The external alarm was now armed. Any movement, any disruption to the room's airflow, and the local police would be notified in under 90 seconds. 9/10 complete, Tamer whispered, her voice tight with panic. Ignore the transfer. We go, Amos ordered, his voice flat. He reached out, grabbing Tamer's arm. The mission had failed. Data integrity was secondary to survival. But Tamer hesitated, looking back at the tiny indicator light. She saw the number jump. 92%. It was the rookie, mystique of fatal attraction to the objective. She pulled her arm free and lunged for the duplicator, attempting to rip it free before the transfer was complete. The sudden, rapid movement was enough. A faint red LED, hidden beneath the base of the server rack, blinked rapidly. The timer for local police deployment had started. Damn it, Tamar, Amos hissed. He knew they couldn't afford a foot chase or a gun battle. The data was secondary. The preservation of the intelligence network was primary. Amos pushed her hard, sending her sprawling behind a heavy wooden desk. He grabbed a small aerosol can from his utility belt knot. A knockout gas, but a specialized acoustic gel. He sprayed a precise ring around the perimeter of the room, damping the floorboards and the doorframe. This bought them maybe 20 seconds before the sound of the approaching elevator became too pronounced. He didn't need the police to be slow. He needed them to be confused. He sprinted to the window, threw it open, a violation of every stealth rule, and fired a single, specialized silenced flare across the rooftops, aimed at an industrial chimney several blocks away. It was a prearranged signal for the external Weaver's team to execute Plan D. Controlled chaos. Outside, 3 blocks away, a small, heavily modified delivery van suddenly accelerated into a controlled slide, taking out 2 streetlights and narrowly missing a taxi. The resulting explosion of sparks and screeching metal instantly drew the attention of the local patrol cars already en route to the high-rise alarm. It was the ultimate misdirection, trading a minor, localized industrial incident for a global intelligence failure. Back inside the apartment, the duplicator hit 99%. Tamar was frantic, her fingers trembling over the disconnect button. Wait, let it lock. Amos yelled over the distant, growing wail of sirens. He had one last chance to neutralize the physical evidence of their presence. Amos moved not toward the server, but Dosaire's desktop computer. He pulled a tiny, magnetized block of C4 composite from his kit and placed it near the computer's power supply. Amos, the data, it's locked, he snapped, watching the progress bar hit 100% and flash green. As Tamar pulled the duplicator, Amos triggered the microcharge. It wasn't an explosion, it was a focused, silent magnetic pulse designed to fry the specific components of the power supply and hard drive controller, making it look like a spontaneous, catastrophic electrical failure. The scent of ozone filled the air. The sudden smell, the faint internal pop asterisk, and the now dead computer were enough to convince Zahiri that his own equipment had simply failed, masking the fact that they had been there at all. They pulled the acoustic gel containment system and were out the door in under 30 seconds. They didn't take the elevator. They took the maintenance ladder, spiraling down 15 flights into the complex's seldom-used subterranean garage. The noise of the city, now alive with sirens chasing the false crisis, gave them the perfect acoustic cover. They had the intelligence. But the hardest part was always the extraction. The garage was cold, smelling intensely of diesel and stagnant water. Their extraction vehicle was a large, nondescript sewage maintenance truck, perfectly positioned near the service exit. It was deliberately slow, bulky, and offensive, the kind of vehicle no one in Istanbul wants to follow or investigate. Amos drove, hunched over the wheel, his movements now sluggish, contrasting sharply with the razor-sharp intensity of the break-in. This was the shift into pure paranoia, the psychological warfare of the escape. Every blinking streetlight, every pair of headlights in the rearview mirror was a potential threat. Tamar, still shaken, clutched the duplicator to her chest. It held the operational roadmap for Z's final Thursday, complete design package for the warhead's triggering mechanism. They drove for nearly 40 minutes through the maze of industrial ports towards the freighter docks on the Anatolian side. The air grew thick with salt and pollution. The silence in the cabin was broken only by the low rumble of the truck's ancient engine. "The clock is running again," Amos finally stated, not looking at Tamar. "The local police will soon realize the industrial incident was a decoy, and the original target was the high-rise." "Do we have time to make the ship?" Tamar asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We make the ship. The question is, if the ship makes the sea." The freighter, registered under a Liberian flag and loaded with several thousand tons of cheap textiles, was their planned escape. The agent controlling the vessel, disguised as the first mate, had secured them passage in a sealed, refrigerated container deep in the cargo hold, uncomfortable, but secure against visual inspection. As the sewage truck pulled onto the dock, the vast, open space felt terrifyingly exposed. They abandoned the truck, tossing their operational gear into the sea it would be found later, looking like discarded fishing nets. They were now ordinary dock workers, making a delivery. They boarded the freighter, navigated the labyrinthine decks, and sealed themselves inside the container. The heavy steel door locked with a decisive, echoing clang. The air conditioning hummed, a monotonous sound of safety. They sat on cold metal floor, finally allowing their shoulders to drop. The sense of profound, overwhelming relief flooded the small space. They had done it. They had the data. "We wait for the horn," Amos whispered. The sound of the ship's departure horn would be their signal of absolute safety. 15 minutes later, the massive engines beneath their feet roared to life, vibrating the entire container. The ship was moving. Freedom was within reach. Suddenly, the rumbling stopped. The engines died. Amos's heart hammered against his ribs. He immediately drew his sidearm, pressed flat against the metal wall. They didn't hear the departure horn. They heard distant shouts, followed by the specific, heavy sound of multiple boots striking the deck above them. It was too fast, too controlled to be dock security. "Inspection," Amos muttered, his mouth dry. "Turkish Coast Guard, routine sweep." Or they found the abandoned truck. The agents were trapped. There was no secondary exit. If the Coast Guard searched the containers, they would be found not as civilians, but as heavily armed operatives, with evidence that could launch a major international incident. The voices grew louder. Right outside their container, they heard the clanging of metal on the neighboring container door, followed by a shouted order in Turkish. Amos and Tamar pressed their backs against the wall, breathing in shallow, calculated gasps. They could hear the voices analyzing the container's manifest tag. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sound was the cold, regulated whoosh of the refrigeration unit and the pounding in their own ears. Then, silence. The boots retreated. The Coast Guard had moved on, satisfied with the external appearance of the seal. Zahiri's operational security had been broken, but the intelligence network, thanks to Amos' meticulous planning, had remained intact. Slowly, agonizingly, the ship's main engines roared back to life. This time, they did not stop. The ship was moving toward the open sea. 3 days later, the duplicator was secured in Tel Aviv. The debriefing room was stark white, silent, devoid of the grime and tension of the field. The analysis team confirmed the data integrity was absolute. Dr. Zahiri's work was months ahead of schedule, detailing not only the delivery system but the exact procurement pathway for the exotic materials needed for the core. The operation had not merely retrieved intelligence. It had purchased an 18-month delay in the deployment timeline. Amos sat across the table from Director Yitzhak, sipping weak coffee. He was no longer Klaus the industrialist or the sewage truck driver. He was just Amos, exhausted and hollowed out. The cost was minimal, Yitzhak said, reviewing the after-action report. Zahiri will report equipment failure. The focus remains on the industrial decoy. No links back to us. A perfect deep reconnaissance harvest. Amos merely nodded. Perfection in this line of work wasn't the absence of error, but the total control over the consequences of error. The operation was a stark lesson in modern espionage. It wasn't about heroic firefights or last-minute escapes. It was about the meticulous, soul-crushing patience required to track a brilliant, paranoid mind to the necessity of becoming part of the urban landscape. Studying patterns like a biologist studying migratory birds. It showed that the quiet, unsung discipline of deep reconda, ability to hold attention for months, alternating between near-sleep levels of observation and moments of hyperfocus crises, was often more powerful than any conventional strike. Zahiri would continue his work, But now, they knew the path he would take, the materials he needed, and the timeline he operated on. They had removed the element of surprise. The success of the mission would never be announced, never celebrated with medals or public acclaim. It was an event that quietly moved the furniture of history, preventing a catastrophe that the world would never know it avoided. Amos finished his coffee. The taste was bitter, but it was the taste of success in the invisible war. Not by the sudden flash of steel, but by the infinite, grueling patience of the man who simply watched and waited.